conference today and tomorrow, that amongst others also serves as a forum for representatives of NGOs active in the field of cultural heritage and cultural property protection, does obviously enjoy governmental support, we must not miss the current trend that on the one hand, intergovernmental bodies and also governmental authorities continue to issue official declarations that devote themselves to support voluntarism, civil society and NGOs in every feasible way, and on the other hand, the momentum created by the International Year of Volunteers in 2001 has de facto lost significance rather soon in so many countries, also in particular in Europe. In regard to public funding, it is evident that especially in the aftermath of the financial and economic world crisis, NGOs of all kinds had to face severe shortcuts. As the deep shock of the crisis is about to be overcome, it is time and it is up to us, NGOs representatives, to return to the governments and remind them of the duties that they have taken upon themselves voluntarily.
I have spent a good portion of my career developing media for museums and cultural institutions and even the UN, trying to help them figure out how to reach audiences. I think there's a real challenge in doing so, and obviously, how do I get people interested? How do I get the largest number of people interested? And really importantly, how do I generate action? How do I not just get them to come once, leave, and never tell anyone they were here? I have contributed to the construction of museums and spent years of my life working on media that I know no one will ever go look at, because no one has actually planned how are we going to get people here, why is it here, and how are we going to make people aware of it. So I wholeheartedly agree with your message earlier, and perhaps because of my cultural bias, I am a big believer that this is where technology can be put to great use, especially now. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, I'd like to go back to 1998, one of the more challenging projects that I had to work on. And this was for a museum, and I recognize this is a little bit outside of the realm that you're discussing here, but I promise it'll come back, so stay with me. So the Museum of Natural History in New York City, great museum, wonderful artifacts, just fantastic exhibit program. They came to me and they wanted to do an exhibit around research that was being done in Greenland, what's called core sampling. And what they do is a bunch of lonely scientists live in this dome for years and drill into the snow that never melts. And the deeper you go, the layers, each layer is another year. And by the time you get a half a mile down, this much is, well, this is a year up top, down a mile beneath the ground, oh, this is around 3,000 years of snowfall. And so they use very sophisticated means to slice the snow, melt it, analyze it, and find out about what's happening in the environment. And so the museum came to me and said, we want to share this exciting work with people. And when I say they want to share this exciting work, what they provided me with was just 30 Excel spreadsheets. This is the thing they wanted to share with a wide audience. And it was daunting and terrifying, but if you sat in the room with the scientists who understood what this data meant, it was incredibly exciting. And the challenge, of course, is to get what happens inside their brains to happen in a large number of untrained brains. That's the challenge. And so what did we do? Well, of course, we told the story of what happens at this site, and we ended up taking those numbers and said, well, how do you make this relevant to a general public? In my mind, that's how do you make it relevant to teenagers? Because teenagers always tell you generally the way the public is thinking. So we turned it into a game. We took all the data and we graphed it out over, we created an animation of the ice being pulled out, rotating over, and then we laid the graph on top of it. So people really understood that you can imagine these graphs drilling down into the earth. And then we built an interface, and I'll remind you, this is 1998, so touchscreens were brand new technology. And of course, that was impossible. In the 10 years I had worked at Teachscape, we had captured 9,000 hours. So how to reinvent our process, how to make this thing that was impossible happen. And so what we ended up doing was creating this sort of Frankenstein monster camera right here. This is a slightly more advanced version right here. And it is a panoramic video camera that sees 360 degrees. So instead of sending camera people into the room and having a boom microphone operator, we put a wireless microphone on the teacher, a microphone near the camera, and the camera sees everything. So, and in 2 months, we captured 22,000 hours. Because after it was put into schools, you couldn't stop people from using it. And this is, I think, the real power of technology. I fully expected that project to fail, 100%. I thought it had zero chance of success. But when you enable people to do something that they weren't able to do before, and I believe that this is generally true, whether you enable them to capture their own practice. In this case, allowing teachers who never get a chance to look at what they do, allowing them to put something in the room that doesn't disrupt their practice, and 3 hours later look at what they were doing, they'll just do it without being prompted. They don't need incentives, they'll do it on their own. And so the question always is, how do you empower people to do something like that? I based on the results of that study, I left Teachscape. Now I make these cameras. That's what I do, is I make panoramic cameras. This is an example of how they work. The top camera is a panoramic camera like this one. We don't really need sound. And the bottom camera is a secondary camera that captures the board, because obviously in a classroom environment, what's happening on the board is very, very important. Then, just because we're in a PowerPoint presentation, I have the whole thing up, but typically, I'll show you in a second, what you really want to do, if you imagine a panoramic view is much like a globe of the Earth, you can flatten it, but Finland gets screwed, right? Everything gets distorted. So what do you have to do? You have to wrap it around a globe to make it realistic. So the best way to view this is sitting inside a cylinder around which it's wrapped. And I'll show you that in a second. This is a great slide. This is the data of the blue curve was what we hoped would happen. And my team represented, this is the capture numbers of teachers. And that spike right there is something we refer to as the cliff of despair. If you had asked me 20 months ago that would I be manufacturing cameras for the education space, I would have said, that's ridiculous. I don't manufacture things, but now I do, because I believe in the transformative power of technology. What's neat about it, of course, is that I can look around inside of it. And I can move any way I want. What the footage actually looks like, by the way, is this, where it's just one of those mirrors that you would find in a market to keep people from stealing. And so the camera points up at the mirror, and then we unwrap it. And by unwrapping it, we allow us not only to create, this is the police telling me I can't do this anymore, but one of the neat things about this is because the media itself is being manipulated in real time, and because computers have become so impossibly fast over the past 6 or 7 years, I can view it in different ways. So if I am a flat, matte kind of person and I want to see the whole thing, I want to see all 360 degrees, I can represent it that way. Or if I want to see both, I can do this. And, riding around the city. And you can see me in the pink helmet, because clearly he was bent on embarrassing me. But what you might notice is that this footage is a little softer, not quite as sharp as the footage of the Parthenon, and that's because it was taken by this, which, if you had asked me was possible 6 months ago, I would have said is impossible. I think there's often a feeling that the past and technology are at odds with each other. I couldn't disagree more. I'm well aware of the perils of technology. I'm a person who has very strict rules about how I use a cell phone. But I also believe that it is a real enabler to bring wisdom to a much larger number of people than is possible without it. And I would hope that, when Darius asked me to come and speak to you today, I said, well, I'm not sure what I can talk about that wouldn't feel like I'm like, oh, use our cameras here and use them there. What I want to sort of express to you is you have a real daunting problem. It's very clear to me. But the question is, how do you reach out to an audience in the most effective way possible? And there are really clever people out there who would love to work with you and help you. I'm just one of them. I know many others. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you.
Let me start with the news from today's newspaper that this morning struck me. The British Museum of London has been robbed. Amongst the several masterpieces stolen, most of the marbles of Parthenon have been taken. 2 Greeks confessed and surrendered to the police, but only after they had given the marbles to the Greek authorities. Well, this shocking news raises several questions, such as, should Greece return marbles to the British Museum? Of course, the news is fake, but a similar story truly happened 1 century ago, when the Mona Lisa, the painting by Leonardo da Vinci, was stolen. The problem with these stories is that there is a conflict of interest, and balancing all these interests is very difficult. My presentation will deal with such kind of issues, and especially will focus and will face an highly ambiguous relationship, the one between globalization on one hand and cultural property on the other. Why this relation is so ambiguous? Because there is a paradox that the more universal, the more important a cultural site is, the more significant it will be at national level. So the paradox is, the more universal and global recognized will be a cultural site, the more important will be for the state and for the nation that hosts it. So this creates conflict, as we will see. Here, the most important things to address is that there is the main problem of definition. So on one hand, it's quite difficult to provide one definition of cultural property from the legal perspective, but on the other hand, legal scholars and lawyers cannot escape defining what cultural property is. So what is the result of this? That you have many different definitions. And if you try to see at international level, you will find that each convention adopts its own definition of cultural property. You will find several different definitions depending on the interest that that single convention is trying to protect or is trying to address. But the other problem is that the legal notion of cultural property is a so-called liminal notion. With the liminal notion, we mean that it's a notion that legal norms cannot define without referring to other disciplines, to other cultures. There is a process of globalizing the cultural property law, and these 3 patterns clearly show this. But the problem that we have, and that this process is still some way off, first of all, it is partial. Secondly, you see that all this system had to face the problem of dealing with different kind of cultural property and different kind of cultural objects. But in spite of this, we see common elements. There is a law-making process growing. You see that the institutional framework is diversified, and you see a growing number of institutions, and you see that the procedural side is becoming much more interesting. And Italy has really to play a leading role in this, especially with the valorizzazione, that if you think that the term itself is very difficult to translate, the official translation is enhancement.